Hello, Madison SLPs. We hope that you are doing well and have adjusted back after your break. This week we are moving into Module 2 and we are going to be talking about a school age criterion reference tool called the Student Language Scale, or the SLS. Just an overview for this module. First, we will go over the Student Language Scale, the SLS, talk about what it is and how we can use it. Then we will make some connections to the academic standards and social emotional competencies, and then we will round out this module with a couple case examples and talk about the value that this tool can add within your evaluations. So as IDEA states, we need to use a variety of assessment tools and strategies to gather our information during our evaluation. And we should not use any single measure or assessment as that sole criterion for identifying a student with a disability. So the SLS is just one small tool that you might consider using within your evaluation. It is an evidence-based questionnaire that can be used to gather multiple perspectives regarding a student's language and literacy skills, and it can give insight into areas of strengths as well as areas of need. It is primarily used for the school-age population, so ages 6 to 18, and a teacher or parent or caregiver can complete it, and it is relatively quick and short, which is nice. Students can even complete it too. It's not as reliable and valid when students complete it, but it can give some good insight. So we're going to focus on using it mainly with teachers within today's module. So this tool has been validated and it's very reliable. And what's really interesting is this tool actually started out with 52 questions, and throughout their process of making it more reliable and valid, they narrowed it down to 12 main questions. So when we look at the validity of a tool, we want it to meet the recommended level of 80%. So this gets into that sensitivity, or how accurately a tool identifies a child at risk for language and literacy difficulties. And for teachers with the SLS, it's 92%. And the specificity, or that ability to identify a child who is not at risk for language and literacy difficulties, for teachers is 90%. So both of these are above that 80%, which indicates that this is a very valid tool. It also has high intra-rater reliability, meaning when a teacher rates a student a second time within 6 months or less, there's high consistency between their own prior ratings, so we can feel pretty confident that the changes we're seeing between the teacher's first rating and second rating are accurate. So it can be a useful tool to see changes in a child's performance over time. So the SLS has three main purposes. The first purpose is that it can be used as a universal screening tool. So you can gather information from teachers and parents and accurately identify students with language and literacy difficulties that might suggest a further need in Tier 2 or further evaluation. I know within the school setting we have limitations about how we can do screening, or how we really can't do screening. So it could be a tool that your school uses, maybe your classroom teachers use it or something like that. That's not going to be our focus for this tool within this module. We can use it to gather input for an evaluation and planning. So like I said previously, we can learn about their strengths and their needs and get multiple perspectives about a student. And a third purpose for it is school-home communication. So if teachers or other professionals are using this tool, they can use it to gather input about all students within a classroom, or maybe a specific group of students they're working with, and use it as a discussion tool during something like family-teacher conferences. Our main purpose for this module is going to be focusing on using the SLS for purpose number 2, gathering input about a student. So like I previously said, it's going to give us more insight into those strengths and needs and help us figure out where we can dig in a little bit deeper and learn more about a student. We can see those multiple perspectives. So if we have one or two teachers fill it out and maybe a family member, we can look at their ratings and we can see similarities and differences. We can get a better holistic picture of a student. It can help us prioritize needs at an evaluation meeting for potential IEP development. So we can look at those areas where individuals agree on ratings For mutual concerns, we can triangulate those priorities, what's going to really help this student be successful, and then we can also discuss differences. If one teacher is rating a student higher in a certain area and another teacher is rating them lower, we can dig into why, so maybe we can understand what is facilitating that success in one setting, but maybe not another. And that also helps us document that educational impact. So we can look across multiple settings and contexts as well as multiple people and understand where a student might be struggling and why, and maybe where a student is more successful and why. The SLS has three main parts. First is the rating scale, where individuals are going to rate a child on certain abilities. Then below that rating scale, there's an ability checklist where teachers can note things that are easy or hard for the student. And then the last section is an open-ended priority question. So the rating scale consists of 12 statements describing various language and literacy skills and related abilities. So a teacher is asked to complete this and rate a student on each of these items compared with other students of the same age. So questions 1 through 8 have a language and literacy focus. And then questions 9 through 12 are the related cognitive and social skills that are related to language and literacy. And then a teacher is asked to rate a student on a scale of 1 to 7, with 1 being not good and 7 being very good. After a teacher completes that rating scale, they're going to move down to completing the ability checklist. So this is a duplicated list with language and non-language skill areas from the rating scale. And teachers are asked to note things that they feel might be easiest for a student, and then to note things they feel might be hardest for a student. And then there's a spot for them to put any additional comments that they feel might be helpful. Last, teachers are going to complete this priority question. So what one thing do you think is most important to help a student do better at school? So it's meant to be open-ended, and it allows us to collect multiple perspectives if we're having multiple individuals fill this out. So it can be something as simple as reading, or maybe the teacher writes a sentence and they have a couple things, but we're really trying to get them to pinpoint 1 or 2 things that they feel would be really important for this student. So we've created a detailed document for you with directions on how to administer the SLS, how to score it and interpret it. So I'm not going to go into all that detail right now. I'm just going to hit the basics, but it's pretty straightforward. It's only going to take a couple minutes to read over, and it will be on our Google Drive for you. So don't feel like you need to write down everything I'm saying right now. So I'm going to go over a little bit of scoring, a little bit of interpretation, and then you'll have that detailed document to follow up on. So the scoring directions are often used when we're using this tool as a screener, but like I previously stated, we're not using it as a screener, but rather that purpose number 2 of gathering input about a student. So we're going to reference these cut scores as our criterion. So the criterion for pass would be that all items, or all but one, are at a level of 5 or above. Something to note though is that if a child scores a 5 or a 6 on the first 8 items, it still could signal a milder concern about language and literacy difficulties. So it doesn't mean that they're good to go, and there might, there still could be some concerns, but maybe not significant enough to be identified with a disability. The criterion for fail is 2 or more of the first 8 items are rated at a level of less than 5. So when a student fails, it indicates further assessment is needed, or in our case, that there is some concern. So it could be consistent with the presence of a disorder. And we know that these tools don't diagnose. It's just one little tool that we could be using within our assessment to get some insight as to a child's strengths and needs and where they might need a little bit more help. So again, we're using it to get input, look at multiple perspectives, look at needs, and look at strengths. So the manual states this little saying here to kind of help with that fail piece. So 2 or more, less than 5 on the first 8. So that's kind of our criterion, our gold standard that we're going to be referencing for a child having some difficulties. When interpreting the SLS, we are going to follow this rule or criteria: 2 or more, less than 5 on the first 8 items. So when you see lower ratings on items 1 and 2, we know that this is going to correlate to school vocabulary when listening or talking. Items 3 and 4 relate to decoding and encoding or spelling. Items 5 and 6 relate to listening comprehension and spoken expression of stories. So this is going to be a rating that we're highly interested in. And then items 7 and 8 relate to reading comprehension and writing. Now, I know that many of these areas get into reading and writing, but we know that language and literacy skills are very closely related and often overlap. So this tool is going to be very useful, especially on teams. So you can share insight with a special education teacher, a school psychologist, or even a reading interventionist, and you can collaborate around these different ratings. And just because a student is rated higher or lower in a certain area doesn't mean that we are solely responsible for that area. So the tool can provide insight across a team, especially because it is valid and reliable. Items 9 through 12 relate to the cognitive and social skills that are tied into language and literacy. So although these items aren't considered in that fail criteria, they are still important and can provide valuable insight. So if we see that a student is rated lower on some of those items, that might raise concern for executive function, maybe attention. And then there's that last question about the social skills. So it can provide some input as to if there's any cognitive concerns or social concerns that we need to take into consideration within our evaluation. Now that we know what the SLS is, how to score it, and how to interpret it, what can we do with this information within our evaluations? One way that we can use this information is to connect it to the state academic standards as well as those social emotional competencies. So I know within your district you have spent some time in past years on those standards and competencies, so many of you are probably very familiar with them. Just as a little review, those Wisconsin academic standards provide those competencies that students should be meeting at those different grade levels, and they really serve as those end-of-year goals for all students. They provide guidance for teaching and learning, and they help us know what students should be able to know and do within the classroom. And many of the standards and competencies directly relate to speech and language skills. For example, the speaking and listening standards all tie to communication skills. And several other standards also require very strong foundational communication skills in order for a student to demonstrate proficiency. So they do serve as a rich source of functional communication skills. And this is a way that we can connect the results from the SLS to those standards. Then we also have those state social emotional competencies, and these outline knowledge and skills that students might need to understand and manage emotions, set and achieve goals, establish and maintain relationships, as well as make responsible decisions. So there are links within our Google Drive to these standards, and the links can also be found on DPI's website. I also know that within your district you may have some internal documents that are specific to your district, so feel free to use and reference those as appropriate. Now that we understand the SLS, we're reminded of those standards, we're going to move into a case study of connecting the SLS to the standards. All right, so here we have a young girl named Lizzie, and she is a first grader, and she has been referred for concerns having a hard time expressing herself and some difficulty with reading. So this is an initial evaluation. So as we are completing the review of existing data, we note some of the following information. So academically, she's having some difficulty with reading and writing, as well as vocabulary and math word problems. We also find out that she is receiving Tier 2 reading intervention that's been focusing on decoding, comprehension, and then making some connections to spelling and writing. And the reading teacher shares that she has been making steady progress, so that's good. When we ask a little bit about some cognitive, social, emotional skills, the teacher said that she can generally focus and she's pretty organized. Maybe a little concern with her memory. Overall, she has good peer relations, but sometimes her peers might be confused when she's talking about something or explaining something. She has good play skills and she can problem solve, but again, sometimes a little bit of difficulty explaining or conversing about problems at times. As far as communication goes, there's those language difficulties that the teacher's noting. No speech sounds, no voice, no fluency concerns. Social communication is a strength for the most part, and just really a little bit of difficulty expressing herself, explaining things, and then talking about stories. So the teacher says, she's fairly independent. She does ask for help most of the time, and there really isn't any other physical or health concerns. So we're working through our evaluation plan, and we decide to include the SLS as an assessment tool that we're going to use for this child. So then once your consent has been received, you give the SLS to the teacher. So this is the SLS results that you get back from the general education teacher. So at a quick glance, you can see some lower ratings, and we're going to apply that criterion rule 2 or more less than 5 on the first 8 items. And by glancing, I can see that she does not pass. So when I look at some of these areas, I can see that 1 and 2 relate to vocabulary, and they're at a 4, so there could be some concern there. When I look at number 3 and 4, those relate to decoding and encoding, and so I can see that makes sense. She is in a reading intervention. Number 5 relates to understanding a story, so that listening comprehension. So there might be some concern. It could be okay. And then 6 and 7, telling a story and understanding a story. Those might be some areas to dig into. And then writing is difficult, which would make sense. If some of the reading and language skills are hard, we know that writing can be challenging. And then when I look at items 9 through 12, these are some of those cognitive and social aspects that relate to language and literacy. And I can see that following directions looks like it could be okay. And, the teacher noted some memory concerns, so there might be a little difficulty there. And then we see that items 10, 11, and 12, so that organization, paying attention, and then those social skills, those are generally okay. Maybe not really any concern there, but just something we'll keep in the back of our mind as we're working through this. And then we look at that ability checklist, which is not pictured here, but the teacher noted that some things that are easiest for Lizzie are art, being social, and that she loves to draw pictures of stories. Some things that are hardest for Lizzie include reading and writing. So the teacher said decoding is hard, and sometimes we're not sure what she understands. And then that priority question, which is not pictured here either, the teacher states the most important thing for Lizzie would be reading skills. So we know that reading intervention is supporting that decoding and encoding, reading comprehension, and a little bit of the writing. And so in a perfect world, this would be a team evaluation with a school psychologist and a special education teacher, and we would be looking at this child as a whole and doing that comprehensive assessment. I know that doesn't always happen, but that would be considered a comprehensive evaluation for this specific child. So we are really going to focus on some of these language skills like vocabulary, listening comprehension, as well as narrative language. Now that I've gotten the SLS back for Lizzie, I am going to connect it to some of the first grade standards, some of those first grade academic standards. So we know that vocabulary was rated a little bit lower, listening comprehension could be okay, maybe challenging, and then spoken expression or those narrative skills are challenging. So I'm going to dig into some of the first grade speaking and listening standards as well as some of the first grade reading standards. Now these standards, they provide support for us to look at a little more of what's expected in first grade. Now keep in mind, these standards are what's expected at the end of first grade. So they provide a frame of reference as we move through our evaluation and we kind of know what's expected. So we know what Lizzie should be able to do by the end of first grade. So it can help guide our observations, it can help us guide collecting work samples, and there are aspects to keep in mind as I'm using different tools and maybe getting some ideas for possible dynamic assessment so I can see how much support she might need with some skills. So the first standard that I look at is this standard here on the left, comprehension and collaboration, and that falls under speaking and listening. So we know that Lizzie should be able to ask and answer questions about details in a text read out loud or information presented orally. So that's getting into that listening comprehension. So I'm keeping in mind that when I do an observation, maybe it's during a shared reading time so I can see how she answers questions. Or if they have a little follow-up activity after listening to the teacher talk about something in science, I can see how is she doing with that. And then on the right here, we have key ideas and details, and this is under the reading standards for first grade. And this gets into reading informational and reading literature. So I know that, again, she needs to be able to answer questions about key details in a text. She should be able to identify the main topic, that main idea with some support, and then be able to retell those details. And then describe characters, settings, and important events in a story or information text. So that's good to know. And we do see that some support is okay in first grade. So that's good to have that idea in my head as I'm going through my evaluation. Let's say I'm collecting a narrative language sample and maybe she doesn't do very good. That might be something that turns into a dynamic assessment so that I can see how much support does she need, and is it a significant amount or is it just a little bit to really determine if it is a disability. So now I want to reflect on what value was added by using the SLS and connecting it to the standards. So we can see that by using that SLS, they didn't pass using that criterion. So it's a good indicator that the student is at a higher risk for language and literacy difficulties because we know this is a valid and reliable tool. So it was a good referral. And obviously we're not going to make any decisions off one tool. This is just a small piece of data that we're going to consider in the bigger picture of all of our assessments. It gave us some areas to really focus in on in our evaluation. So you can have more focused observations, collect more specific work samples, and you can do all of this before you're done with some of your other testing in your comprehensive assessment, which is kind of nice. You can target some of those observations early on as opposed to doing some of your testing and then doing observations. So it just gives you a little more flexibility. Along with those areas to really focus on, we made those connections to those standards. So now I have a better idea of what's expected in first grade. So based on her performance and possible level of support that I might determine through a dynamic assessment, I can know if this support is excessive, a significant amount of support, or if she just needs a little bit, I know if it's appropriate or not. So keep in mind, these standards are what we expect at the end of the year. So even if she does need some support, it might be okay depending on the skill and depending on how much support she needed. And then we can also look at that SLS that the teacher completed to support and document that educational impact. We did see some lower scores. So depending on how all of her results come out together and we converge all that evidence and put it together, we can see, is there really an educational impact and is there that significant discrepancy that would be indicative of a disability? So before I jump into the application activity for this next module, I want to just address some cultural and linguistic considerations for the SLS. So the SLS was developed and standardized for students in the United States who've been learning English since birth. So it could include dual language learners, whose family members may communicate more comfortably in a language other than English, but it has not been validated as a screening tool for students learning English as a second language unless they've been speaking English since birth. But it can be used for the other two purposes, so gathering input and that school-home communication. So in our case, we're using it for gathering input. So you could still use it with dual language learners, multi-language learners, and gather important input, but it would just be something to keep in mind and always kind of interpret some of those results with a little bit of caution. So bringing Module 2 to a close, we have an application activity. If you go to our shared Google Drive, you're going to find detailed instructions there with all the links that you need to complete this application activity. So first, we want you to kind of review those administration directions so that you understand how to administer, score, and interpret the SLS. This should only take a couple minutes, and then you'll have it for future reference. And then we would like you to pick a case study to review. You're going to review it, interpret it, and reflect on that SLS. And then we would like you to submit a Google Doc with some very brief notes about the value added, what you learned, how you might use that information in a follow-up conversation with a teacher if you were working with or evaluating this child. There are a couple options for case studies, so if you just want to briefly glance at all of them and then you can choose one that is most applicable to your caseload, that would be great, and you only need to do one. And then after you interpret and reflect on that SLS, maybe you try referencing an academic standard or one of those social emotional competencies based on your interpretation of that student's SLS if possible. So maybe you just try connecting it to one standard. And if you feel like this application activity is becoming a little bit too time consuming, go ahead and skip the standard part and we'll discuss it further during our coaching session. Which then leads me to, we will be doing another coaching session for this module, so we'll discuss the information you learned from the SLS, the value that it added, and how you might use that information. And then if you didn't get a chance to connect it to a standard, we can kind of talk about that. And then something that is totally optional is feel free to try it out. Feel free to explore the SLS. If you have a student that you're working with and evaluating, go ahead and give it a try. You can contact your lead SLPs to get a copy of the questionnaire, and your district also has access to a manual that goes along with this as well. So we hope that you enjoyed learning about a new tool that you can consider within your evaluations. And the SLS can provide a lot of insight into strengths and needs. It can help support that educational impact, and it can even help lead to possible functional therapy goals. As always, please feel free to reach out to me or John if you have any questions or need support.